Hi, so my name is Steve Puckett. I'm an Armed Forces veteran and I'm currently the Director of Needs Training Solutions. I grew up in a place called Hyde in Southampton. I was there from birth up until the age of 16. So actually walking into the careers office, obviously being a young boy still, I had to have me, mum told me and for me. But that went relatively well. I already knew what I wanted to do. Obviously I had career advisors there trying to sort of talk me into something, i.e. what their cap badge was, but I was sort of stubborn in that way. That I'd already been focused on actually joining the Guards, and that's all I could see at that point. Yeah, I remember getting picked up from the train station, and that's when it all started. It was just a case of like, right, get in here, do this, do that, and you're like, oh, I'm not even here yet, you know. So, but yeah, basic training was 56 weeks. That's purely because we were what we call junior soldiers, so we weren't adult soldiers, so therefore their basic training was less. So because we were juniors, they had to shape us and obviously get us ready for battalion life. Battalion was actually quite daunting as well because it was in the middle of London. Big new world for me, being a country boy. Never been up in a built-up city at all, apart from actually going to the Trooping Colour with my aunties. But the battalion life itself it all depended on what sort of turnover it was on. So basically you would have what we call silly season. Silly season is when you do all the public duties, that regiment does all the public duties for all the major sort of royalty locations there. And when you're not on that, then it's all to do with training. So again, this is where you're going to fit in your fitness tests, i.e. your combat fitness tests. You'll go on your exercises, you may be deployed overseas to do exercises. But also, not taking away the fact is in the period of time there as well that you could be deployed, and at that point it was Northern Ireland. So there was lots of stuff going on. I did 3 tours of Northern Ireland. My first interest in dogs was actually on my first tour of Northern Ireland. I remember being sat up in an observation point, looking over a hill. It was actually tipping it down with rain. We were all soaking wet, it was cold. And then all of a sudden the helicopter come down with a single dog handler on it, to actually search this bun line. The helicopter actually stayed in the air for that said dog handler, and then they took off again and we ended up walking back. And it's from that point where I thought, well, if I do leave the army, at that point I didn't have any intentions to, but I thought if I did, then that's the job I want, because I wanted my own helicopter. First of all, I left the army in 96, or the back end of 96. I got called up to go to Bosnia, and then I spent 2 years in Bosnia. That was when I decided then, my end of my contract, and wasn't going to go any further. I decided to sort of end my contract as it was, because it was only on a full-time reservist basis. Then I always thought that there was something missing. So from 2000 up until 2009, I do believe it must have been, that I always had that thing of actually rejoining again, but my age was going against me. It wasn't until then they actually changed the age that I actually managed to sort of get in. So 4 weeks in Melton Mowbray, doing the basic dog handling course. So that was doing all the GP work, learning about dogs, learning how to look after them, not only just inside the kennel environment, but also out on exercises as well. I actually chose to go to Germany, and that was my first choice, and I was quite glad that that was the choice that I got given. And the reason for that is because I identified that the training areas that they had were a lot better than basically going down to Aldershot or something like that. So upon going out to Germany, I went straight into 103. We had a good structure, good command. So 103 was the squadron to be in at that time. Half the squadron was actually out already on tour in Afghanistan, and then the other half were in Iraq. So we pretty much got assigned to being dog walkers and just basically maintaining the dogs, what we had left over. So it didn't take away from any training. We still did train with the dogs. It's just that obviously with the squadrons being split, being on tour, there was a lot more stuff to do in terms of obviously the welfare for the dogs. We were then on a rotation, so we actually had the our next tour wasn't for another 2 years. So this is when we started then gearing up, basically a year prior to that, in terms of getting the dogs. I was assigned to do high assurance search, which is basically teaching a dog to search in a straight line. We do this to cover ground, and we cover bun lines, and it is literally the dog having its nose to the floor in terms of obviously what is actually designed, or trained to actually search for. That was when I then went out on tour as high assurance search. We was then actually attached to the Royal Engineers, so they've got their independent search team. So we went out there pretty much as that sort of confidence in the team and the confidence in the dogs, so we can actually send the dogs forward. So we were actually forward of the forward people, if that makes any sense. So it was, really, some days were good, some days were bad, but then again it goes with the territory. Our actual role within theatre, we would, again being attached to the Royal Engineers Search Team, a lot of that was to do with routes. So we would actually go out on routes that sometimes people hadn't actually been out on before, so the information that we would get is from the air. So if they suspected any sort of ground sign, within certain areas, especially along specific routes that maybe someone's going to be using later on, we would actually go out and search that route prior to actually anybody going onto it. We didn't really stop there, because we actually did other things as well. So we'd actually we'd search abandoned vehicles, we'd search potential fob areas. Okay, again, just checking for devices that may be there or secondaries in and around the area. It's down to you to maintain your dog. You don't get rest days, so you do in terms of not going out on the ground, but the thing is you still have to train your dog. And so I had a really, really good dog, and that dog really looked after me, to be fair, and also looked after the team. So so lots of training done. So, and then just waiting to be called. We would get given tasks. Again, they may be 1 or 2 days in advance before, so we can actually prep ourselves, but sometimes we would actually be on that immediate action to actually move out. In all honesty, I can't remember actually the day, like waking up. I can remember being on the helicopter. I can remember it was the only time I've been out there being told to fix bayonets on the helicopter, ready for getting off. And then we got off, and then we just basically started doing patrolling, clearing, working with the Afghan National Army, clearing compounds and things like that, and doing sort of soft knocks. The initial incidents, there was obviously helicopters involved with evacuations and things like that. I managed to get back, right or wrongly, I managed to actually get myself back in. Things happened along the way, but again, to me, it was irrelevant at this point, because my hearing had already gone, so I couldn't really hear a lot of what was actually going on. So I got back to the fob, and all the preempts of the fact is that there's this thing of like, I'll be right in the morning type thing. I got seen over by the medic there because I did have blood coming from my ears, and the dog mirrored the same injuries as what I had. So they literally had to get us back to Camp Bastion to be properly checked over by the medics, or doctors and nurses at Camp Bastion. It was then, that was the point when they basically said that I won't be going on the ground anymore, that they'd be pulling me out. But the thing is that they couldn't fly me back because my ears were too bad. So I had to wait for a couple of weeks for my ears to actually start to sort of do some sort of healing process. Otherwise they couldn't fly me, and I'd have been just stuck out there until my ears have actually healed over. So during the time of that 2 weeks or so, I was basically back with the squadron that was out there. I sort of more or less got put in charge of the the calibration side of things with the HAS dog. So again, looking at, they seen it obviously best to keep me busy, and the medical was saying you can't keep him because he needs to go to Selly Oak Hospital to be properly checked over. I spent 4 days in Selly Oak Hospital when I was originally flown back. It's quite surreal, really, because when I was at Selly Oak Hospital, there was actually 2 other dog handlers that were actually involved in incidents prior to me actually getting there. So it's good to actually see them and actually see how well they were actually doing. It was upon that, after that, I then got flown back to Germany. Basically going on from there, that I then started a whole lot of treatment phases in terms of like psychological meetings, and then going on to psychiatry and all that. But that wasn't until some time after. A lot of these things take a while to actually set in. So a lot of people don't actually get any signs or symptoms at all, until later on. So I still had like everything going on with my ears because they say that they were damaged. I had tinnitus and other problems that was going on. But in terms of the actual psychological side of things, that didn't actually pan out till later on. So going through the treatment phases that I was going through, I then, because I could no longer work with dogs, and that had already been pushed out there because of my hearing, so I then got pushed to another squadron, which was 105 Squadron. They were then actually gearing up to go back out on tour again. And at that point, it wasn't something that bothered me to an extent, but it did, because the fact is that if I went out, then I wouldn't be able to go out on the ground. Now, I totally get the fact is that I had injuries already sustained from a previous tour, but it doesn't stop you from the wanting, to actually go out when you get out there. My role when I was back out on tour was a kennel manager, and this is where my behaviour itself actually started to change. So I had a few snaps prior to actually going out on tour, but I wouldn't say that they're anything significant. It was only till when I was out there that it was coming towards the end of my tour. I always took my leave. I always went out on normally like the last set of leave from going on tour, my R&R. It was basically coming towards that. Then a colleague of mine said to me, pulled me to one side and said, "Steve, you need to get some help, because I've seen your behaviour and it's certainly changed over the period of time from basically gearing up to going through Germany and then now being back out." He says, "I don't know if it's your job that you're doing or if it's a case of it's something that's obviously had an impact on you from your previous tour." It was then that I then paid lip service to it and said, yeah, no, I'll do this, I'll do that. And then when I went on my R&R, so I'll do it when I come back from R&R. It was then that when we was coming back, I only got as far as Cyprus, because then the squadron basically were pulling out earlier than expected. So I only managed to Cyprus, and then we ended up basically just going back from Cyprus. So I never actually went back out into theatre after my R&R. It wasn't until obviously we had our pothole and things like that, then I identified myself and took on board what this individual actually said. And then when I actually took a a self-reflection, and I just went, I do need the help. And I think that's the biggest obstacle that anyone can actually come across, is to identify, that they actually need help, rather than just someone telling them. Yes, it takes someone to tell you for you to have that reflection. So that's when I then started to actually seek the correct help from there on in. In terms of help that I received, I had to go to the doctors to actually get referred, to these psychologists. They then deemed it that I needed further treatment, because again I still had all the injuries that I was bearing, and I still had now had this psychological, the emotional side of things that I then had to deal with as well. So upon seeing a psychologist, they then referred me to the psychiatrist. So the psychiatrists are there to basically give me the tools in terms of managing myself. I spent probably literally the rest of my time in Germany, literally under psychiatric help. So you're going on probably two, maybe 3 years of actually having the help. The problem being is the fact is that I was always getting shipped from one psychiatrist or one mental health nurse to another mental health nurse, to a psychiatrist, to another psychiatrist. And it's really hard for anyone to engage with so many different people, because you end up talking about your story over and over and over and over again. And sometimes it's not the fact is that people want, they want to share this information, but it all deals on how many times do you have to share it. So I end up just saying, you see my notes, read my notes. Because I just didn't want to go back through it all over again, until they had an understanding to where I was at that point. As time went on, the actual care that I was given, and it was getting more and more and more. Sometimes I'll be having like 5 treatments, in 1 week, and work was actually really forthcoming with that. Actually, to be fair, I got changed job roles, where I actually, got a job within the headquarters, where I was then, not going to say managed better, I was just managed differently, in terms of they identified that my workload was too much for me. They identified the fact is that I had to go to appointments, and don't get me wrong, even in my previous role being in the stores, my SQMS at the time was absolutely amazing. He didn't mind if I needed to take time off, then I took time off, but he knew at the same time I was a worker. So if I had the time off, there's a big reason for that, and he would actually come and see me. So eventually going into headquarters, and again, very forthcoming in terms of my workload and all that sort of stuff. But it got to a point where I was no longer a soldier, to put it into better words. I was a non-combatant. I was doing a job or jobs, that an actual combatant could do. I was basically just put there to go, right, you can fill that gap for now type thing. So the preempt obviously is always to get better, but there's always a thing of how long is it going to take, and with the armed forces is that they had already spent the best part of 3 years with me trying to get me better. But there were still certain jobs that I couldn't do. I couldn't go on exercises, I couldn't do fitness tests, I couldn't do anything, in terms of like the military sort of cycle. That's when they had to say, look, unfortunately, we are going to have to medically discharge you due to your injuries that you sustained. Obviously, that's the big part of my life. Obviously, I've been doing it on and off since I was 16 years old, so that was then my career was a case of like, I now need to accept what's going on, which I'd already sort of put myself in that place anyway, because I knew what was happening because of so many appointments, that I then basically had to accept it, and then sort of decide what I was then going to do. The aftercare I received, on being discharged, because I was still under the psychiatrist, I then got put on through to the psychiatrist that basically dealt with basically as being part of the Armed Forces Covenant, we were still able to access help. So I had access to that help for 6 months. That then stopped. Then they could no longer do anything for me. I then spent 6 months of basically just trying to use the tools that they had given me to actually sort of, in a better way, to manage myself. I then took a downward spiral again, and then I had to basically self-refer. So still going under the Armed Forces Covenant, then I self-referred and then started to then regain and get that help. The problem with that help, again, is that you only get so many sessions, and yes, you get a lot more sessions what you would do if I was a civilian and wasn't medically discharged, but it even then got to the point that I was then having to re-explain my whole lifestyle again, and then sort of going basically from the beginning. And that was the hardest thing, because I was actually engaging with civilians, not military doctors. At least military doctors can have a little bit of a better understanding, but whereas civilians, I'm not going to take anything away from them, but the fact is that they've not experienced an army lifestyle, so therefore they've never walked in your boots type thing. But said that, they don't need to. All they need to do, they just need to gain a picture of what you've actually been through, and then they can actually then give you the tools to manage that. So they don't always have to be in that, walk in those same shoes. But I didn't realise that till probably, in if I had 18 sessions, for instance, I didn't get 18 because I got 16 because they said they could no longer do anything for me, but I didn't identify that for probably the 10th session or something like that. So, which gave me a better understanding of civilian or psychologists, psychiatrists as a whole. People often say, well, they don't know anything. Well, the fact is they don't need to have, as I said before, walk in your shoes. They need to understand where you've been, and then they can actually then give you the tools, to actually, help you manage your own situation. Upon basically, obviously being discharged from the military, I knew myself that I couldn't actually be employed by anyone. So I had to go down the self-employment basis. And this is where NEATS Training Solutions, and that's where it evolved from. The NEATS part of it is actually the name of a dog. So they always say, try and name a business that's something that's personal to you or close to you. And that is me. So NEATS has always been close to me. She's pulled me out of every sort of dark spot that there's been. She's basically kept me to where I am now. So just having that connection. So again, she's a Belgian Shepherd, so that's what I trained was in the army. So I still got that connection with that. Whilst I was doing that, I also got a burger van, and I called it Neek Snacks. So again, it had the connection with the dog, but also where I parked it was outside the army camp up at North Lothian. Again, that was a lot of it. So I had that connection. In terms of I could still see friends if they come up to the van, and it's always good to have that connection. So in terms of where I actually live, I wouldn't say I bought the house to have that connection, but it was more bought that it was a commutable distance if I did get that soldier on. And the fact is that, and again, if mates wanted to come to have a bit of time out, then to actually come and help me, the fact is that it was achievable. So I think it's really important to have a connection and still keep a connection with someone that you are close with, someone that, they may have not been in the same incident as you, but the thing is that they've walked basically the same ground as you. And I always say that therapy comes in many, many different forms. The fact is, it's normally the ones that are closest to you, i.e. not your parents or anything like that, because again, they probably wouldn't understand as much, but certainly with colleagues and friends that that I've been with. And I find just talking through friends that helps a lot. And I would actually say that's probably about 90% of my therapy has actually been through just having that connection and someone that I can actually just ring up and say X, Y, and Z. And even if it's not to talk about what I'm going through at the moment, but it's just to have that conversation with someone about anything, basically often, just puts you back into a better mindset. So, again, going back, I would always say if you can keep connections, then keep those connections. Again, there's always that thing is that they're never too far away. There's always someone on the end of the phone, and obviously the phone is endless, isn't it? So it doesn't matter if they're in this country or another country, always keep that connection because they're there for you and they're listening to you. But just like to add on to that, for those that are suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is that help is available there for you. And as I said before, sometimes it's just a case of talking to your own friends, but the fact is, always seek that help because it is there. But the thing is that we have to get into our own minds. The fact is that we got to want to get better, and that's the biggest challenge, accepting what's actually happened, having the want to get better, but also the need. And that need could be because of not only for yourself, but also for, family, friends that are around you, because it affects your social circle and everything like that. So there's an abundance of help around there. There is the referral scheme that basically people can go on to, obviously being military. There is also obviously the doctors, and the doctors can refer you onto the psychologists and psychiatrists. But definitely from my experience, I've been going through this journey, so to speak, for probably, I think it's about four and a half years now. And what I will say is the fact is that I'm not fixed, because the fact is that it still has an effect on me. But what I can say is that I'm able to manage those effects. And the biggest thing is that as soon as you identify that there is something wrong, because you've identified it within your own social circles or someone said to you, then seek that help. But it's all about how you manage these signs and symptoms. But more importantly, you've got to be kind to yourself, and that, as I said before, and I keep on saying it, the fact is that there is help out there. So please, do seek that help. Before it gets worse. Otherwise, again, I've been in therapy for probably about 4.5 years now, and it is what it is. But there is certainly a lot of help out there. So yeah, just pick up the phone if you need to.